Hello, this is NEET Intel. It is February 26, 2025, and something I've been discussing on X, something I've occasionally been discussing in the chat box. I don't really expect the average person who follows this project to pay too much attention to the chat box, but X is a, sort of direct accessory to this project. But even then, I know a lot of you guys don't follow or don't want to follow X or this, that, or the other, which means you do end up missing some stuff because not everything is worth making a video about. But this is actually a pretty major shift for the channel because I know a lot of you do follow this for what has been its primary scope and focus for the past 3 years, which is monitoring the HFGCS. And obviously for the past couple weeks, the HFGCS frequencies have not been the subject of videos on this channel, and I don't expect them to immediately return to being the primary focus of this channel. And I'd like to explain why that is and essentially provide a steelman argument to you folks that after 3 years of monitoring the HFGCS, this project has accomplished what it set out to do, and short of some material changes or a real rejig in how we approach monitoring HFGCS, I think 3 years may be good enough. And this will kind of be an opportunity for folks to express their thoughts or opinions or even strong disapproval and directly reckon or not reckon with the many suggestions I've made about how to do this the past few years, which I do feel have gone ignored. And that's one of the many conditions that I think need to be discussed. So just as an overview, this project's monitoring areas, like I just said, really the main focus would be the bullet points at the top. This is a channel that primarily has been monitoring the HFGCS, especially the what I consider to be the main frequencies 8992 and 11175 within the continental US. It has also in the past and continues to concurrently on occasion listen to those frequencies from outside the continental US. There are also some accessory frequencies that we've occasionally, or, the last few days with Mars Radio dipped our toe in. And then there are also some things that we've looked at or not looked at in the case of number stations, and some things that I do want to look at, and we'll talk about those. Most of you are familiar. I've given this spiel before. I am not a military analyst. I don't have any special source in the U.S. military. None of that. I am just someone who back in January of 2022 became interested in the HFGCS, became curious about EAMs, and when I tried looking into what these things were, what these things meant, there wasn't a lot of information out there. And so I came to the conclusion that, wow, the internet really sucks at monitoring the HFGCS. Now, in the first year and a half, and really up to the present, the reason I say the internet sucks at monitoring HFGCS is because the resources that I found with, quick Google searches or DuckDuckGo searches or whatever search engine of choice you may prefer. Some of the things I found, and some of you may be familiar with, and we'll just go in order here, in air quotes for a reason, long-time monitors, it became quickly apparent to me, and some of you will be familiar with, for example, a little bit of overlap here with YouTube monitors. Long-time deranged nemesis of the channel kind of shut up and ran away when I challenged him to a debate one-on-one. KLW News, great example of someone who claims to have monitored the HFGCS for many years, and the more you talk to this guy, and the more you talk to other people online who claim to have monitored the HFGCS for a long time, there are a lot of little tells that some may even have monitored for a while, but it's not, it doesn't mean anything. They tuned in for an hour a day here or there over the years, every few weeks. That doesn't count as comprehensive monitoring. That you listen to 11175 on Sunday afternoons every now and again when you were bored doesn't really grant you some seniority position or turn you into a subject matter expert of the HFGCS or give you any special insight into what these messages might be. And as I have in the bullet points there, it's also possible some people are just lying for clout, and there's actually no credibility to these so-called long-time monitors. Problem is, the internet takes them seriously, and that leads you to, wow, the internet sucks at monitoring the HFGCS because, it trusts these morons. Having said that, we can move on to the second category. There are people who clearly have monitored the HFGCS for a very long time, but as I've made no secret in conversations with some of them who then subsequently blocked me or whatever have you, a lot of, one-off instances, and they all tend to end the same way. Even if you did, put in a best effort to monitor the HFGCS for a long time, there were never any consistent consistent efforts to, with very few exceptions, no sincere efforts to publish their information or share it or like collaborate with other monitors and try and create like a database. So it's a lot of what I would call working hard but not working smart, which sort of ends up, I hate seeing it. It drives me nuts. And in effect, I almost feel like we're at the same point. I know it's only been 3 years, but this is part of my steelman argument. Unless we can start working smart with this, it's just going to be more hard work. So that was another resource. And again, the big issue there is just they weren't publishing their stuff. So it's good that you did that, but you weren't sharing anything. So it doesn't help the internet. And so, wow, the internet still sucks at monitoring HFGCS regardless of your best efforts. We've already kind of talked about YouTube monitors, but I will say, because I know there are a couple of ops out there who do keep an eye on this channel, my general criticisms of the channels that exist right now, aside from the ones that are obviously just in it for the money and really half-ass it, you can go to these channels and they'll really just give you bare bones, superficial information because they don't listen to the advice that I've published, which is the number of EAMs that go out any given day isn't necessarily meaningful. And if you're not publishing transcriptions, you're not publishing recording, there's no way to verify your information. And this is important for everyone. It's really shocking to go through some transcriptions and compare them to the recording and be like, how do people get this wrong? And I include myself in this. It always surprises you to discover which characters you mix up, or sometimes you record an EAM as an EAM in full, and then if you bother to listen to the end rather than just the first pass, it's like, wait, that message was disregarded at the end there. These small little things get missed, and if you're not publishing your stuff and it's impossible to verify, it's actually not worth anything, in my opinion. And the last thing, EAM.watch is a specific example, and I mentioned them because I did try and work with that website for about 1.5 years. I previously, on the previous channel for this project, actually put out a video explaining my experience with that website and my regrets interacting with that community in specific. But the appeals of it are listed there. Well, actually, they're not listed there, but on the surface, it is a open source intelligence website that does have an automated recording system set up. Unfortunately, they're recording EAMs from Europe, which means they miss a lot of traffic in the US. So I don't know why they're doing that. As far as transcriptions go, it's very obvious if you keep an eye on the website, which I and a few other people peripheral to this project do. There is no quality control on transcriptions. The people who run the website don't keep an eye on this. As I do discuss in this video, I had a gentleman's agreement with that community, which said, I'm not going to go out of my way to re-upload this video from an old channel to this channel, but they are subtweeting your boy, so that gentleman's agreement is off. I think I do have a civic duty to warn anyone else that ends up in my shoes. Do not go through the same misadventure that I did. Those guys are not serious about what they're doing, and it's really shocking to look at some of the screenshots of the Discord server or whatever that is sent to me, and it's like they have worse than the memory of a goldfish. I don't know how they know less about the HFGCS than they did 3 years ago, but that's actually the same experience that I had 3 years ago, that they seem to know less than they did 3 years before that, so maybe I shouldn't be so surprised. My point being, the internet sucks at monitoring the HFGCS. Now, in most of the live streams on this channel, I have linked to the video on the left where I discuss who I am, what I've been doing, my methodology, my goals. So a lot of that is going to be familiar to you guys. If you haven't watched that video, you have to watch it to know what's going on. I don't care. Under 2,000 people have watched it now, so I'm trusting that you're one of them. If you're not, I don't know what to tell you, whatever, I don't care. People don't listen to me, and that's going to be one of the things that we'll talk about here in terms of some frustrations going forward. So the live streams on this channel have typically focused on the first thing, which is monitoring the HFGCS on 8992 and or 11175 within the continental US. And that has been the focus for quite a while. I've explained why 11175 in specific is the more interesting frequency of all frequencies to monitor because there is a lot of additional activity. We have especially seen that in the last few months, so we're not stopping because things have slowed down or anything like that. And I've also discussed why, it makes more sense to monitor within the US rather than outside of it. But we have hit a number of road bumps the last few weeks, and this was discussed in a tweet that I sent out on February 14th. So I want to go through this with you guys, and we'll just read this out, or most of it. We'll skim a little bit verbatim. So the HFGCS 24/7 live stream on my YouTube is not up right now, and I expect this to become more common. Please note that this is not because there's not much going on. And I list off for you there some of the notable events that were going on at that point, and a few of them are still ongoing. E6s are still broadcasting 274 messages. A few days prior to that, there was a Tetra 8 Octopus, whatever you call that, HF voice message a few days ago. There was a message for Region Charlie broadcast on the 14th. Those of you familiar will know there are only so many of those region messages broadcast a year, and it is always nice to grab a recording of that. So it wasn't that I was listening to the HFGCS and thinking, oh, there's not too much going on. It's more that we ran into some issues. The stream has experienced a spat of bad luck with SDRs it utilizes. Back in the summer of last year, the main SDR I used to monitor the continental US went offline and never returned. To avoid an excessive reliance or undue burden on any one SDR subsequent, I set up a script to rotate through a series of SDRs. This has not been without its pros and cons, but the last few weeks, and especially the last few days, a number of SDRs it has a soft reliance on have gone offline, and in one case blocked the stream, which they're completely entitled to do, even if their provided rationale is mistaken. So if you guys were on the stream on the day that that one SDR blocked, I didn't make a big deal of it. They blocked on the mistaken impression. There's actually a comment on their website that says, for monitoring the HFGCS, just use the one SDR in Europe. You guys will be really, really well aware, I've already mentioned in this video, monitoring a US military communication system from Europe is dumb. You miss a bunch of traffic, but that is the general incorrect information as people understand it online. Again, you should not be surprised to find out the internet sucks at monitoring the HFGCS. But just to give you a little bit more context here, so there was an SDR in smack dab middle of the United States in Kansas. It was great. It was great at receiving HFGCS frequencies. We loved it. I emailed the person who ran the SDR. They said, yeah, you're free to use it as much as you wanted. So I had that going for the better part of a year, and it's what allowed me to move away from on HFGCS in Europe. When that went offline, it had already months prior started to have issues receiving HFGCS. So when it went offline, I was like, oh, it's probably not worth reaching out to that person to figure out what's going on because it seems to just be having issues. With Kiwi SDRs, you never want to use anyone too much. I've posted about this in the past, but some of them don't appreciate it. If you're just parked on a frequency all day, the people who make these things available online do so voluntarily. They're not obliged to do that. So even if the rationale doesn't make sense, that's just their rationale and it is what it is. So I'm sensitive to that. And that's why I made sure that I had that script going so that I never on any one SDR too much. That, as I wrote in the post, there are a few SDRs in specific that get really good reception of the HFGCS and are in opportune locations within the continental US. There's one or two in California. There's one in the Gulf. And to be honest, I'm not ever really that worried about the East Coast. I think SDR locations on, Western continental US and either like central or southern Gulf of America region would be the most important ones. Sometimes people ask, why don't I just resolve all these issues by getting my own SDR without doxing my location? I'm not in those opportune locations. I'm a little bit redundant to some of the other SDR options that I don't even use anyways because they're not in great locations in my opinion. So me getting an SDR doesn't solve the problem one way or the other. But there have been people who've lived in those areas in the last few, couple of years who've said, oh, I'll set up an SDR. There's also people who I know live in those areas. I'm like, why don't you set up a stream? And they just don't do that. And, that's fine. No one has to do anything. Nobody has to listen to me if they don't want to, right? I can put suggestions out there. I can say, this is how you could do this. This is how you could do this well. But no one ever really takes me up on that. So again, So with all these problems mounting and with me really wanting to not put any undue strain on any one SDR, especially when it's obvious they don't like people sitting on them all the time, with very few exceptions. There's only a couple in the US that I know really don't care and are still around. And with the 3-year anniversary of this project happening in January of this year, we sort of come to this point and we come to this strongman argument, and I say, in some ways, I've already achieved what I wanted to achieve. Most of the questions I have about the network and how it has or apparently hasn't been monitored by hobbyists over the years have been answered. The continuous monitoring of the HFGCS already accomplished in the past showed that the network is not a completely nebulous and undecipherable black box, and provided good evidence to debunk a lot of quote-unquote common sense about it. Continued monitoring is not likely to break new ground along these lines, and I probably already have enough information to start working on a website and or wiki. And if you watch the video on this website that I did put out in February earlier, I did mention if any of you have experience setting up a wiki from scratch, please reach out. That is the next thing that I think needs to be done. But the gist of this part of the post, we've been doing this for 3 years, ladies and gentlemen. We now can answer all the questions that I had back in 2022. What's the typical number of EANs a day? Is there any rhyme or reason to these things? There's so many things that we've discussed and accomplished and identified. And again, well, if you watch the video on the right, you get to hear about all the chaos that I've had to go through and the wastes of time with that specific community. But on the other hand, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of successes. There are things that were not published I couldn't find online, which I have now identified, a lot of those routines and things like that. So the question is, if I monitor the HFGCS for another 3 years, am I really going to find out anything that I haven't already? Not under the current conditions, not under the current methodology. That is the pitch that I would be making to you. Going forward, given all that I've just said, nevertheless, there is interest in continuing to make such a stream available and continuing to monitor some of the more dynamic elements as discussed, but we've reached the problem that I foresaw a while ago. In other words, none of this is a surprise. I've discussed all of this in the past. You've heard me, issue these grievances, so none of this should be taking anyone by surprise. This project is a successful proof of concept, but it's not sustainable on its own. I've said so many times over the years, I expect someone better positioned, whether it's geographically or technologically or otherwise, to take over and do a better job of this than I have. I've been doing this for 3 years. I thought it would have happened by now. That it hasn't doesn't to me necessarily mean that I continue to do it. And that's kind of the rub, because I know many of you are interested in me continuing to do it. And you guys will remember, one of the things that I set off to do this was to figure out, why does the internet suck at monitoring the HFGCS? And I've just told you why. And I hope to set an example of how you should do this. In other words, you publish transcriptions, you have recordings available so that people can verify those transcriptions. You look for routines, you share that information, you try and collaborate with people who are subject matter experts, real or self-titled or practically, in other areas, and look for correlations. And the main thing that I found out, and I've had to, sort of reel myself in a little bit, I'm not Steve Jobs. I'm not the president of Apple. I can't yell at people. No one is my employee. So I don't get to be an absolute monarch and get to, make an iPod. I kind of have to settle and pick my battles and whatever. But generally speaking, people haven't taken my suggestions on board. And so it doesn't surprise me, and it certainly shouldn't surprise anyone else to find out that after 3 years of no one, taking on my example, wow, the internet still sucks at monitoring the HFGCS. Why do I say that, given the success that this project has had? It's had an impact. I've mentioned this in some posts. There are some corners of the world where I look up, NEET Intel, and I see who's talking about me, what kind of influence am I having on various corners of the shortwave world. And now and again, I do get mentioned. And it's not about credit, just seeing, am I having an impact, positive or negative? I am, but for the most part, as I alluded to with the AM.watch Discord community, is a great example. How is it possible 3 years later, people are having stupider discussions than they had 3 years? It drives me nuts. It drives me nuts, ladies and gentlemen. It drives me nuts to look up on a shortwave discussion board, someone reporting, I heard something on 4724 kilohertz. What is that? Or I think I heard an EAM. Well, did you or didn't you? Like, this is not difficult. This is not rocket science. Ladies and gentlemen, I trust you. You are smarter than that. I refuse to believe someone can be this stupid. I can't. I can't, guys. I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it. We need to rejig things or something. So that's what I want to talk to you about in terms of what we've been doing and why we've been doing it. So let's just kind of look at the monitoring areas of this project. Again, it's almost kind of sorted in terms of highest priority, highest focus to all the way to the bottom. And I want to just go through them, step by step. The main thing, the most important thing in my opinion, is looking at, these frequencies, 8992 and 11175, and it really should be within the continental United States with, only an auxiliary or incidental focus on traffic that you might receive in Europe or Asia or, I don't know, Japan. We have hundreds of recordings. I have published thousands of transcriptions. We have the Daily Time Card Project. We have all sorts of things available to you now so that if you're interested in knowing what a typical day is like, what the typical message looks like, you have more than adequate response to that question now. Another thing, what I would suggest is kind of the next most interesting thing would be, well, what's it like in other parts of the world? And that, as I alluded to earlier, is very much how this project started off. Like everyone else who found out about the U20 web SDR, said, ooh, I'm going to use that SDR because there's no timeout, until eventually it became obvious to me this is pretty stupid what I am doing. It would make more sense to monitor the HFGCS from the United States. Having said that, there are still some idiosyncratic things. I think right now, actually, there would be some benefit to someone running a stream of the University of Twente and doing a good job documenting it. We've been hearing Wolfhound, which is their Amstrine airbase. Incidentally, I haven't done those streams, but that's something someone could do. That's one of those many suggestions I put out there. If I'm doing this, someone could do this. Nobody listens to me. So when I'm streaming, 11175 from an SDR in California, turns out 10 other people are also listening to 11175 kilohertz from SDRs in California. That's not helpful redundancy. Doing two different things would be a helpful redundancy.
And also editor NEET Intel right now, just to point out, like, no wonder these SDRs turn off or like shut themselves down because you have 10 people listening to the same frequency. Of course, these people get pissed off, or of course the SDR, some of them are solar powered, they just run out of energy. So it's completely counterproductive. Of course, like, why do we have these issues? I don't understand it.
So if I'm doing this, you can do that, or vice versa, or whatever it is, but that's never quite panned out. The other thing, monitoring these non-primary frequencies, I think there is some interest to that. And I say that because I think it's been a blind spot. 4724 kilohertz, I almost never monitor. In some sense, you'd be listening to that just to get an idea of reception quality at various times of day. But we do know, for example, during Skymaster events, that 4724 can sort of be an autonomous, self-sustaining frequency. We've also, for example, I think that's when we had one of the Esteem Highly Alpha exercises heard on 4724. Not 100% sure. I think no one does listen to 4724. I think someone should. That's something we can actually discuss and come back to. But those would really be the main things. Moving on, I get to mention null, but I have them on the right as an example of, we become aware, or just sort of become aware of the significance of some of the patterns of, when do the E6s broadcast on VLF or the, Verdin? I don't remember what the abbreviation stands for in full, but null has sort of been one of those people to say, oh, if you've got the HF covered, then I'll take over with the VLF. And that's been great. So I think I have like 1 or 2 videos published. I can't even remember if I've published them. I think they've come up occasionally in live streams. I've pivoted to them to just have a couple of recording examples. I know I've posted some to X, but that is something we could look at. I think actually if someone has an SDR, I'm just going to say this right now as one of the suggestions. If you're in the continental United States and you have an SDR that can pick up very low frequencies, why don't you set it to 17.8 or 27.2 or whatever the heck the other one is? I'm blanking on it. And just have a continuous monitor of that. Set up a YouTube stream and make sure you have the text box there. And that would be really great to have an idea, especially right now when E6s are flying dark. It could act as kind of a trigger to be like, oh, there seems to be an E6 broadcasting in the AM right now. Again, me buying a SDR, I don't live in these areas, so I can't do it. Me as someone who is not in the US, I can use an SDR located in some of these areas, but if I'm on there 24/7, they're going to kick me off. And they have every right to kick me off, which is why if you live in those areas, Why don't you set that up? That is one way the monitoring of the HFGCS and this activity with the E6s could meaningfully advance. Nobody listens to me. Again, this is a steelman argument. Why does nobody do that? That's my question. Moving on. So this is something we've looked at. Actually, I've done a couple experimental live streams. We do know there are other frequencies. The Charlie Echo window is 9031 kilohertz. There are also a number of Stratcom Zulu frequencies. And I think the questions that I had back in 2022 about the HFGCS could definitely apply to these frequencies. 9031 kilohertz. What does the typical day on that frequency sound like? How often do the E6s use that frequency? When we have on this project pivoted to that frequency, it's because we've actually heard them say, we're going to go to the Charlie Echo window now, or sometimes they do actually say 9031 kilohertz or 9.031, whatever. But we also know, ladies and gentlemen, at least a few times I've said, oh, there are two E6s in the air. Why don't I hop over to 9031 and see if they happen to be talking, and I'll catch them like mid-conversation, even though we didn't hear anything on an HFGCS frequency about them going over to 9031. The problem with monitoring this is I don't think it's terribly active. It might be like a once a month thing, but I would like to know that answer. What is typical? Is it, twice a month? Is it once a month? Is it once a quarter? People did not receive that stream well, but they're thinking of it in terms of, well, why are we monitoring this instead of the HFGCS? We're missing EAMs. Ladies and gentlemen, we could transcribe another 10,000 EAMs, but if we're not doing anything with them, and we're just constantly in a reactive mode, then we're not getting any more information. We're kind of at the diminishing returns phase. I would be suggesting, why don't we hop over and monitor these things? Because we don't know a lot about them. Why don't we learn a little bit more about that? The third thing, we have dipped our toes in this the last couple days. In specific, Mars Radio is a volunteer-supported system that is used by the Department of Defense, really mostly for radio checks, incidentally some phone patches. So some of the more juicy or unconventional stuff we sometimes hear on the HFGCS frequencies, most of that traffic actually should be, is my understanding, handled by Mars Radio. But in many ways, it's kind of like listening to paint dry sometimes. So it's boutique coverage. I would not be recommending that, this year, NEET Intel will be focusing on Mars Radio. I don't think anyone would be that interested in that. And I don't feel too strongly about it. Again, in contrast, if we were to look at some of these auxiliary frequencies that I think are misjudged or, underestimated, even if it ends up being active like once a month or something, I think that's something to look at. Moving on. So there are other things, when we say, well, what else can we monitor here on the internet? People have often asked, do I monitor number of stations? Do I look at UVB 76? Do I look at, what is it now, the Stalingrad clock? Like all this stuff. I think if you're interested in number of stations, Prion.org has this stuff covered. They've done a good job of it. If you want to know about it, they have the website, they have the Discord, they have recordings, they have transcriptions. Now, this is something there's not a strong demand for this at all, but some of you might remember on the previous channel, every now and again, I would tune into the North Korean Central Broadcasting Station. That broadcasts, I think, 22 hours a day. There are incidental recordings of it on YouTube or elsewhere on the internet, but they're usually just short, like, 5 or 10 minutes long. Just like, oh, look, listen, they're broadcasting. I think it would be interesting. I don't think it's, a noble long-term goal to just continuously monitor this frequency and make recordings of it. But we will be doing some more trial recordings this week. I just want to make sure because they do play music on the station, which makes me wary about getting hit with a copyright claim or a copyright strike. Now, some of you are wisely thinking North Korea is an isolated regime. It's not subscribed to the global idea of copyright. So copyright claims, copyright strikes shouldn't be an issue. The thing is, there are some orchestras, there's some, concert halls, whatever, various artists, musicians, groups that have cleverly thought, why don't I make a performance of this song so that I can copyright that performance? And then even though it's not their performance being played, the algorithm will detect it as similar and hit me with the copyright claim. This has happened at least a couple times, even with what you would assume to be public use music. I've complained at YouTube about how this doesn't make sense, and they really don't care. I'm not concerned about copyright claims. I don't monetize any of the live streams, but copyright strikes are an issue because that is essentially 3 strikes, and you're out, like, your channel's deactivated and you're done. So, that's something to be wary of, but I would like to do, 3 or 4, maybe a week's worth, something along those lines, no more than that, just so that that snapshot is available. And again, that's something we have done in the past with this project, so it wouldn't be, out of the blue, although some of you have only followed in the last few months or past year or so would not be familiar with that. But that is actually something I'm interested in doing. So that is actually, of the various points that I proposed to you, that I think is going to be the things that I'm focusing on for February is almost done, but for March, I want you guys to be aware. We will not be doing so much of this for now. We will be looking at this. So the two things in specific that I've highlighted. This, would be the anything else, and this would be, I don't know what are the answers. How often do they use the Charlie Echo window? How often are they using these Stratcom frequencies? I would like to know, and nobody else is doing that, so that's fine. Now, as I say that, something I've suggested in the past, and nobody's ever taken me up on it, but if anyone's very upset about this right now, while I'm doing this, you guys are free to do this, right? You can set up these streams, and if you need help with the script, or streaming on YouTube, it's not an open invitation to anyone, but like if I recognize your username, you've been around, you've supported the project directly or indirectly, I'll be happy to, assist you with that. The reason it's not completely open source, because there are so many people I've tried working with in the past, act like they're in it for the interest and then just turn around and it's all about the money, which brings me, that's a thread we need to revisit in a moment. Am I saying we're never going back to the HFGCS? Again, this video is the strongman argument or the steelman argument. I'm just providing the argument in extremis and asking you guys, as it says in the post that I put on X today, what is the value proposal for continuing to monitor the HFGCS on top of the 3 years already done? If we're still transcribing these things manually, in other words, people are spending, 2-3 minutes every time doing these things, and that adds up quickly, more than you would think. Like, you end up spending hours a week, hours a month. Is that time that could be better spent elsewhere? I think I've been too optimistic about the promise of getting AI to transcribe these things. I thought it was just a question of processor power. In many ways it is, but my impression now is not just like, oh, you just need like a decent computer and just like dedicate, the whole CPU or the gigawatts or whatever to it. I think it needs to be a really good computer, and I understand why nobody's, stepped up on that. But the other thing, I kind of allude to it here. If we provide the internet 10,000 transcriptions, here's what the AM looks like, here's what group it's in, here are the dates, and no one ever says, oh, it's interesting that these things are broadcast on this date, this date, this date, because there was actually military exercises that we know about on this date, this date, this date, or this is interesting because this happened when this strange flight activity that I didn't quite understand was broadcast around the same time. And there's a consistent pattern of that. People have sort of criticized me, and I would say it's the wrong way. You guys might remember, people often said, what's the point of what you're doing? You can't actually decipher any of these. And I guess my point would be like, well, what's the point of you like tracking all these planes if you're not the one flying them, or like you don't really know what they're doing? You just know what they're doing extra. Like what's that's not a meaningful criticism, but I would have liked to see a little bit more of like starting to connect the dots. And again, people say, well, why don't you do this? That's a great question. Why don't I do this? And it ultimately comes down to time management. I think most people are generally more competent than we understand them to be. In other words, as I've often said, if you're like intimidated by anything I've done here and you think, oh my goodness, I can't do that, that's not true. Again, I had no background specialty in this, and a lot of this is just, methodology, making sure you are consistent, transparent, that like just basic principles so that when you do make a mistake, it can be caught and you keep going. But it is time consuming. It adds up. So when I spend time, making a post saying it would be nice if someone were to collect this information and compare it with that, nobody ever does. Or when I say, oh, it would be interesting if someone were to take the AM transcriptions I published and compare them to this list of red flag exercise dates I just found, and nobody ever does that, then the question becomes, what is the value proposal of continuing to do this? If we're just constantly transcribing AMs and we're never actually looking at them, then what are we doing? And that doesn't really mean, again, like the earlier criticism, No one was trying to decipher these. You morons. You crazy people. I'm gonna take you out and then take me out, and we're gonna get taken out. I can't. It's such a dumb and wrong, incorrect thing. But why does nobody ever do these things? And it's fine. You don't have to. Nobody has to listen to me. I'm not Steve Jobs. This isn't Apple. I don't get to yell at you. But that also means that we're never making the iPod, which is a fantastic piece of technology. I understand that Tim Apple is a much more benevolent and patient CEO. And guess what? Apple hasn't made anything as good as the iPod since Steve Jobs passed away. The Apple Watch is, fine. The Vision Pro flopped. People don't like being yelled at, but that's how better things are made in the world. I don't get to yell at you, so I have to pick my battles. And I think this is a battle I'm picking. So that's the question. What is the value proposal of continuing to monitor the HFGCS on top of the 3 years already done? It's published. Those transcriptions are out there. You can look at them. You can compare them to dates of other military exercises. You can be able to do this, and nobody ever does this. If I have to do it myself, and I could, and I probably could, and I could find something, it's more time. Now, I mentioned this to someone in the Discord, and I think this sort of becomes germane right now. So another thing that might change and make me rethink and say, okay, ladies, okay, fine. We'll go back to doing this. Okay, we're not going to do this faffing around because nobody we'll be very transparent here. If the folks who are sponsoring me on, Patreon or YouTube, and you guys know who you are, if you message on, whatever and say, well, but this is too big a change. I don't like this. I don't like this. We've given you a lot of free reign, but this, not monitoring the HFGCS, not what I signed up for. You need to be monitoring the HFGCS. That's fine. We'll go back like that. No problem. I understand that. That's totally, absolutely fine if I'm overstepping here. Because I have said, you guys keep me around. But then, and I'll leave this open for everyone to kind of chew on. Because I remember making this as a passive threat about 2 years ago. If no one ever matches or surpasses me when it comes to the quality of the work that I'm doing here, then there's no benefit to me staying integrated into the open source intelligence model. In other words, if I'm sharing all this and it's not quite being reciprocated or no one's doing anything with it, and it's really just the folks that are supporting the channel that are keeping it going, then it becomes a question, do they actually, what is their perception of what this project is? Because if they're okay and they just say, you know what, I would actually like member perks where we do what all these other communities have done, and this information is kept behind a paywall because I paid for it and the rest of the folks didn't. And we kind of turned that corner because no one else, again, no one is following up on any of these suggestions. No one is monitoring additional frequencies when I monitor 11175. They're not pivoting to 8992. They're not covering other things. Then, I can start experimenting with a hard paywall. And then I can kind of talk about, well, what if we actually pay someone in California or Texas to set up an auxiliary stream and set that behind a paywall that's just available to the people who are in this? I'm actually open to that. I think after 3 years of trying to collaborate with the wider internet and not really being terribly happy with the results, we can talk about that. So those are kind of the questions that I'm throwing out there. The biggest one, I think, ladies and gentlemen, if you're someone who is just interested in HFGCS, hundreds of videos on this channel, hundreds of live streams, what is it that is not already captured that you still need captured? My proposal is the stuff on the right, or the stuff that's highlighted here. If you want to stick with this, then I think, it's kind of a question of, well, what are we doing? And I do think folks who sponsor the project will get a say in that. They get to be the Steve Jobs in the metaphor that I gave earlier, because they are paying me and they do get to yell. And the people who get to yell at me over on YouTube, remaining in the up north tier because of continuing to sponsor the channel to the magnitude he has, up north gets to yell at me and say, hey, stick to 11175, or maybe he'll say, you monitor whatever you want to. That's good. That's fine. You do that. Great. And over on Patreon, in the Skymaster tier, we have Paul. Paul would get to yell at me very loudly. Paul's very chill. Paul's a chill guy. Everyone is chill, to be honest with you. But if they wanted to, they can. And in the Octopus yell, they get to yell, not as loud as Paul, but they still get to yell. Aaron, Espresso, and Rick, thank you very much for supporting the channel. And obviously anyone else over on Buy Me a Coffee, on, the crypto blockchain gibberish, you can sponsor me that way. If you'd like to know how to sponsor me that way, you can always reach out. Anything in this video that you have questions about, comments about, criticisms about, comments down below. If you want to email me, then you find the the email. If you don't know what the email is, you should find it. It's not hard. That is a basic, trial and error. If you can find the email, I will trust that you're competent enough to be communicating. If you can't find the email, then I don't want, what if you're a telemarketer? I just don't want to give out my email. That's not a big ask. So thank you. I hope you saw all of those slides, and I hope you have something to say. And if you don't have something to say, then that's fine. Have a good weekend.